By April 1945, Berlin was no longer the proud capital of a thousand-year Reich. It was a city collapsing inward on itself, surrounded by Soviet armies. Its streets reduced to rubble, its civilians exhausted, starving, and terrified. Deep beneath the shattered streets, Adolf Hitler had retreated into the Führerbunker. The bunker was never meant to be a permanent residence. Built beneath the Reich Chancellery, it was designed as an air raid shelter. Its rooms were small, its ceilings low. The air thick with dampness. Water leaked through the walls, paint peeled. The smell of stale air, fuel, and sweat lingered everywhere. This was where Hitler chose to remain, even as most of his inner circle fled the city. Above ground, Soviet artillery pounded Berlin day and night. The sound was impossible to escape. Even inside the bunker, explosions rattled the walls, dust falling from the ceiling with each impact. The Red Army was closing in from all sides, street by street, building by building. Maps in the bunker showed shrinking pockets of German control, marked with pins that moved closer to the center every hour. Hitler, now 56 years old, was a shadow of the man who had once commanded mass rallies. His health had deteriorated rapidly. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His posture was stooped. His face appeared gray and swollen. Witnesses later described him as physically frail, struggling to walk, often dragging one leg behind him. Long gone was the confident dictator of earlier years. Despite the reality outside, Hitler clung to illusions of reversal. In nightly military briefings, he demanded reports from generals who no longer had armies to command. He spoke of divisions that existed only on paper and counterattacks that were militarily impossible. When officers hesitated or tried to explain the true situation, Hitler exploded in rage, accusing them of betrayal, cowardice, and treason. One of the most telling moments came when Hitler placed his last hopes on General Felix Steiner, ordering a counteroffensive to relieve Berlin. Steiner's forces, however, were fragmented, under-equipped, and incapable of carrying out such an operation. When the attack predictably failed, Hitler erupted. In a now infamous outburst, he declared that the war was lost and that everyone had betrayed him. It was the first time many in the bunker heard him openly acknowledge defeat. Yet even after this admission, Hitler refused to leave. Offers were made to evacuate him south to the Bavarian Alps, where a final stand could be staged. He rejected them all. Berlin, he insisted, would be his last battlefield. If the Reich was to fall, it would fall with him at its center. Life inside the bunker followed a grim routine. Meals were simple and repetitive, often consisting of pasta, vegetables, and canned food. Hitler had become a strict vegetarian, partly for ideological reasons, and partly due to worsening stomach problems. Food supplies were dwindling. Even high-ranking officials felt the shortages. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, remained with him in the bunker. Unlike many others, she refused to leave, even when escape routes were still possible. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, dressing carefully, applying makeup, and occasionally playing music. To some, her presence seemed surreal, a desperate attempt to deny the reality closing in around them. As nights passed, sleep became increasingly difficult. The constant shelling made rest nearly impossible, and Hitler often stayed awake until dawn, pacing, talking, or staring silently at maps. His conversations turned darker. He spoke obsessively about loyalty and betrayal, about how the German people had failed him and did not deserve survival if they could not win the war. Above all, a sense of inevitability filled the bunker. Those closest to Hitler could feel it, even if they did not say it aloud. The outside world was gone. Communication lines were breaking down. Orders sent out from the bunker rarely reached anyone. And when they did, they no longer mattered. This was the beginning of Hitler's final nights, trapped underground, isolated from reality. clinging to fantasies while the world he had shaped through violence and ideology collapsed around him. By the second half of April 1945, the Führerbunker had become more than a shelter. It was a sealed, psychological world, cut off from the city above and increasingly detached from reality. As Soviet forces tightened the ring around central Berlin, the bunker's inhabitants sensed that time itself was shrinking. Days blended together, marked not by sunlight or clocks, but by the rhythm of artillery strikes and the arrival of increasingly bleak military reports. Hitler's daily routine had narrowed to a rigid pattern. He would wake late in the morning, often exhausted after another sleepless night, then slowly make his way to briefings where generals presented maps that no longer reflected any meaningful control. Entire army groups had ceased to exist. Yet Hitler continued to issue orders as if they could still maneuver. His commands were absolute, delivered without room for debate, and rooted in the belief that willpower alone could alter material reality. The generals who remained were placed in an impossible position. To contradict Hitler invited fury. To comply meant participating in a fiction. Many chose silence. Others attempted careful phrasing, hoping to soften the truth without provoking an outburst. But even this became dangerous. Hitler's temper was unpredictable, swinging from cold withdrawal to sudden explosions of rage that echoed through the narrow corridors. These outbursts were not merely emotional. They reflected a deeper psychological shift. Hitler increasingly viewed the collapse of the front not as a consequence of overwhelming Allied power, but as a moral failure. In his view, the German people had proven unworthy of victory. If they could not endure, then destruction was justified. This thinking hardened into something close to fatalism, though it was directed outward rather than inward. Inside the bunker, this attitude poisoned relationships. Longtime associates felt the change most sharply. Joseph Goebbels, still loyal to the end, attempted to reinforce Hitler's worldview, speaking of sacrifice and historical destiny. Others, like Martin Bormann, focused obsessively on control, managing information and limiting access to Hitler as if the structure of authority itself could delay collapse. The physical environment worsened as well. Ventilation systems struggled to cope with the number of people and the constant generator use. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, mixing with the smell of damp concrete and fuel. Water shortages forced strict rationing. Even basic hygiene became difficult, adding to the sense of decay and confinement. Meanwhile, reports from above ground were grim. Entire neighborhoods had fallen to the Red Army. Civilians flooded underground stations and cellars, seeking refuge from bombardment. Fires burned uncontrollably across the city, visible even from bunker entrances when guards briefly emerged. The Reich Chancellery above had been heavily damaged, its once grand halls shattered and unusable. Despite this, Hitler insisted on symbolic gestures. Flags were still raised, orders were typed, stamped, and filed. There was an almost ceremonial quality to the routine, as if maintaining appearances could preserve legitimacy. For Hitler, symbolism had always mattered, and even in defeat he clung to the rituals of power. Eva Braun continued her quiet efforts to soften the atmosphere. She organized small gatherings, offered drinks, and spoke cheerfully about trivial matters. To some, her behavior seemed detached, even inappropriate, but it served a purpose. Normalcy, however artificial, was a form of resistance against panic. Yet even she could not ignore the tightening circle of destruction. One evening, Hitler spoke at length about history. He compared himself to figures from the past who had faced ruin and betrayal. He framed his struggle not as a military failure, but as a tragic inevitability shaped by fate. Those listening understood that this was not analysis, but justification, an attempt to control the narrative of his own downfall. As the days passed, Hitler's trust narrowed further. He suspected conspiracies everywhere, convinced that surrender-minded officers were undermining him from within. The failed assassination attempt the previous year still loomed in his mind, reinforcing his belief that betrayal was constant and unavoidable. This paranoia further isolated him, leaving only a small inner circle with regular access. Outside, Soviet artillery moved closer, now audible as individual shells rather than distant thunder. The war had reached the doorstep of the bunker itself. For the first time, even Hitler could no longer pretend that Berlin might be held. The question was no longer whether the city would fall, but how long the bunker could remain untouched. This growing realization marked a subtle but critical shift. The bunker was no longer a command post directing a war effort. It was becoming a waiting room, a place where decisions would soon turn. By the third week of April 1945, the reality pressing in on the Führerbunker could no longer be managed through routine alone. The outside world was collapsing in measurable, irreversible ways, and even within the protected walls underground, the sense of finality began to shape behavior. The sounds above had changed, not only in volume, but in meaning. Artillery no longer came in distant waves. Individual impacts could be distinguished, closer, sharper, sometimes followed by the prolonged rumble of buildings collapsing. The front was no longer approaching Berlin. It was already inside it. Hitler continued to receive military briefings, but their purpose had shifted. Earlier in the month, briefings had still carried the pretense of coordination and control. Now they served primarily as a ritual, a continuation of command without substance. Maps were updated, but the areas marked under German control grew smaller by the day, until they represented isolated fragments rather than coherent positions. Communication with field commanders was sporadic, often reduced to delayed messages that described situations already overtaken by events. Physically, Hitler appeared increasingly diminished. He moved slowly, often leaning on furniture or walls as he walked through the narrow corridors. His hands shook constantly, and his speech, once forceful and theatrical, had become quieter and more uneven. Observers noted long pauses in conversation, moments when he seemed to drift inward, as if rehearsing thoughts that no longer needed an audience. These changes were not sudden, but cumulative, the visible result of years of strain now compressed into a final period of confinement. The structure of authority within the bunker remained intact, but its function had narrowed. Decisions were still issued, yet fewer people acted on them with any expectation of success. Orders to reposition units or hold specific sectors of the city were acknowledged formally, even when it was clear that the units in question no longer existed in any meaningful sense. This was not deception so much as inertia, the continuation of a system that had not learned how to stop. Berlin's defenders reflected this breakdown. Regular army formations had been destroyed or scattered. What remained were improvised forces composed of older men, teenagers, and remnants of shattered units. Many lacked proper weapons or training. Ammunition was scarce. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. Yet, from the bunker, resistance was still demanded, framed as a test of will rather than a matter of feasibility. The gap between command and reality widened with each passing day. Within this environment, Hitler's thinking hardened along ideological lines. He increasingly interpreted events through the lens of betrayal and moral failure. In his view, the collapse of Germany was not primarily the result of Allied material superiority or strategic coordination, but of internal weakness. This belief allowed him to preserve a sense of historical logic, even as his practical authority dissolved. If the German people could not endure the struggle, then, in his reasoning, their fate was a consequence of that failure. Those closest to him adjusted accordingly. Joseph Goebbels reinforced this interpretation, speaking in terms of sacrifice and destiny rather than recovery or compromise. Martin Bormann focused on maintaining control within the bunker itself, managing access and information with increasing rigidity. Others withdrew emotionally, limiting their interactions to essential duties, avoiding conversations that might force acknowledgement of the obvious. The bunker's physical conditions mirrored this psychological contraction. Ventilation systems struggled under constant use. The air was stale, heavy with smoke and dampness. Water was rationed and sanitation became increasingly difficult. Power outages occurred more frequently, sometimes plunging sections of the bunker into darkness until emergency systems restored minimal lighting. Each technical failure reminded those inside that even their refuge was finite. Eva Braun remained with Hitler, her presence steady but increasingly quiet. She continued small domestic routines, dressing carefully, maintaining a composed appearance, and avoiding overt expressions of fear. For Hitler, her loyalty reinforced his belief that remaining in Berlin was an act of resolve rather than resignation. For others, it underscored the narrowing world inside the bunker, where personal loyalty replaced strategic purpose. Information from outside grew fragmentary. Reports of civilian suffering reached the bunker indirectly, often filtered or delayed. Large sections of the city were without food, water, or medical care. Fires burned unchecked. Refugees crowded underground shelters, while hospitals operated far beyond capacity. These realities existed alongside the bunker, yet felt distant, as if belonging to a separate world. By the final week of April 1945, the separation between the world above and the world inside the Führerbunker had become absolute. Berlin was now a battlefield in the most literal sense, its streets contested block by block, its remaining infrastructure collapsing under constant pressure. Inside the bunker, however, time seemed suspended. There was no natural light, no clear sense of day or night, only the persistent vibration of distant impacts and the dull awareness that the city's fate was being decided without them. Hitler's command style grew more rigid even as his control diminished. He continued to insist on absolute obedience, issuing directives that assumed coordination, mobility, and resources that no longer existed. These orders were delivered with a tone of certainty, as if firmness alone could compensate for material absence. For those receiving them, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. The structure of command remained, but its purpose had shifted toward preserving the appearance of authority rather than achieving results. The military situation reports became increasingly symbolic. Maps were updated less frequently, not because conditions had stabilized, but because changes were happening too fast to track meaningfully. Soviet units advanced regardless of German orders, exploiting numerical superiority, overwhelming artillery support, and logistical depth that Germany could no longer counter. In contrast, German defenders relied on isolated pockets of resistance, often cut off from supplies and communication within hours of engagement. Hitler's reactions to these reports followed a pattern. Initial silence would give way to sharp criticism, directed not at the enemy, but at his own commanders. He accused them of lacking resolve, of misinterpreting orders, or of acting independently. These accusations were rarely specific. They served instead to reaffirm his belief that defeat was the result of human failure rather than structural collapse. This interpretation insulated him from confronting the consequences of his own strategic decisions. Within the bunker, relationships grew strained. Conversations were shorter, more cautious. Many avoided extended interaction with Hitler, aware that any discussion could trigger anger or suspicion. The atmosphere was not one of panic, but of tension held in check by habit. People moved quietly through corridors, performed their duties methodically, and avoided unnecessary gatherings. The bunker functioned less like a headquarters and more like an institution waiting for closure. The role of Joseph Goebbels became more prominent during this period. He positioned himself as both confidant and interpreter, translating Hitler's worldview into a narrative of endurance and historical necessity. In private discussions, he emphasized legacy over survival, suggesting that how the end was faced would determine how it was remembered. These ideas resonated with Hitler, who had always viewed himself as a figure of destiny rather than a conventional leader. Martin Bormann, meanwhile, focused on maintaining internal order. Access to Hitler was increasingly restricted, not only for security reasons, but to control the flow of information. Bad news was filtered, sometimes delayed, sometimes softened, in an attempt to prevent emotional volatility. This insulation further separated Hitler from reality, reinforcing the closed system of belief forming around him. The bunker's material conditions continued to deteriorate. Food supplies were rationed more strictly. Meals were simple and repetitive, offering little comfort beyond routine. Water shortages affected hygiene, contributing to discomfort and fatigue. The constant presence of generator noise, combined with poor air circulation, created a sense of physical oppression that mirrored the psychological strain. Eva Braun's presence remained a constant, though her role subtly shifted. She spent more time quietly observing rather than actively engaging. Her loyalty was unquestioned, but the strain of confinement and the proximity of danger were evident. Still, she did not express a desire to leave. For Hitler, this reinforced the idea that remaining in Berlin was a shared commitment, not a solitary decision. Outside, the civilian population faced escalating hardship. Entire districts were without electricity or water. Medical facilities struggled to function amid shortages of staff and supplies. Civilians moved cautiously through ruined streets, seeking shelter from ongoing fighting. These realities were no longer distant rumors. They were unfolding directly above the bunker, shaping the city's final hours. As Soviet troops advanced closer to the government quarter, the bunker's vulnerability became more apparent. As April drew to a close, the Führerbunker entered a phase defined less by military collapse than by psychological finality. The possibility of escape, once discussed quietly and then dismissed, had now effectively vanished. Soviet forces were fighting within a short distance of the government quarter, and routes out of Berlin were either cut off or under constant fire. For those inside the bunker, the question was no longer whether the war could be saved, but how the end would be faced. Hitler's thinking during this period became increasingly inward and absolute. He spoke less about operations and more about loyalty, endurance, and historical judgment. His sense of responsibility shifted in a revealing way. Rather than viewing himself as accountable for Germany's fate, he framed events as a test imposed by history, one that others had failed. This perspective allowed him to withdraw emotionally from the consequences unfolding above ground, even as he remained physically at the center of them. Discussions about evacuation resurfaced briefly, raised by officers who still felt a duty to preserve what remained of the leadership. The idea was not new. Relocation to southern Germany had been proposed weeks earlier, when movement was still possible. Now, it was largely symbolic, an acknowledgement that remaining in Berlin meant accepting whatever end awaited. Hitler rejected the suggestion without hesitation. Leaving, he insisted, would be an act of weakness, a betrayal of the image he believed history demanded. This refusal carried consequences for those around him. By choosing to stay, Hitler implicitly forced others to decide whether they would remain as well. Some began to prepare quietly for escape, requesting permission to leave, or simply making themselves scarce. Others stayed out of loyalty, fear, or resignation. The bunker population slowly thinned, not through evacuation plans, but through individual decisions made in moments of clarity or desperation. Within the bunker, routines persisted, but they felt increasingly hollow. Briefings were shorter. Conversations were cautious. There was an unspoken understanding that many words no longer mattered. Even disagreements lost urgency. What replaced them was a subdued attentiveness, as if everyone were waiting for a signal that had not yet arrived. Hitler's physical condition continued to decline. He tired easily, his movements slow and deliberate. Meals were taken in silence or near silence, often cut short. His tremors were more pronounced, and he relied increasingly on aids for basic tasks. Yet, despite this visible frailty, his authority within the bunker remained unchallenged. No one openly confronted him. The structure of obedience held even as its purpose dissolved. Eva Braun's role during this time became more central, not in terms of decision-making, but in shaping the emotional environment around Hitler. She spoke less, but her presence was constant. She did not press him to leave, nor did she express fear about staying. Her acceptance of the situation reinforced Hitler's resolve and provided a form of personal validation that no military success could now offer. Joseph Goebbels, too, adapted to this final phase. His language shifted further away from strategy and toward interpretation. He spoke of legacy, of how the final days would be remembered, of the importance of resolve in the face of inevitability. These conversations were not about changing outcomes. They were about controlling meaning. For Hitler, this focus aligned with his lifelong emphasis on image and historical narrative. Outside the bunker, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Soviet troops captured key buildings and bridges, cutting remaining lines of movement. German resistance became fragmented and localized, often ending within hours due to lack of ammunition or leadership. Civilians continued to suffer, caught between advancing forces and collapsing infrastructure. These developments filtered into the bunker sporadically, stripped of detail, yet impossible to ignore. The sense of enclosure intensified. Each explosion felt closer. Each report confirmed that the perimeter was shrinking. Even without direct discussion, everyone understood that time was no longer measured in weeks or days, but in hours. This awareness did not produce panic. Instead, it produced a quiet narrowing of focus, a turning inward that mirrored the physical descent beneath the city. By this stage, the Führerbunker had fully transformed from a command center into a place of conclusion. It was no longer about issuing orders or coordinating defenses. It was about endurance, presence, and the refusal to acknowledge alternatives. Hitler's decision to remain in Berlin was not a tactical choice. It was a personal and symbolic one, rooted in how he wished the story to end, rather than how it might continue. By the final days of April 1945, the Führerbunker had entered a state of suspended inevitability. The question of whether Berlin would fall was no longer discussed, because it had already been answered by events outside. What remained was the management of the last moments, shaped by habit, ideology, and a shrinking circle of people who understood that no intervention could alter the outcome. The bunker no longer functioned as a headquarters in any meaningful sense. It had become a place where conclusions were quietly prepared. Hitler's detachment from operational reality deepened during this period. Military briefings continued, but they were increasingly brief and ceremonial. Reports confirmed what everyone already knew. Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly, German resistance was fragmenting, and no coordinated defense remained. Hitler listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes interrupting with comments that reflected belief rather than analysis. His authority persisted, but it was authority without leverage, sustained by structure rather than effectiveness. At the same time, Hitler began to devote more attention to matters that suggested permanence rather than survival. Discussions turned toward documents, statements, and the preservation of records. He spoke about how his decisions should be understood, how responsibility should be framed, and how history might interpret the collapse of the Reich. These conversations revealed a shift from leadership to legacy, from influencing events to defining their meaning after the fact. Within the bunker, this shift was recognized even if it was not openly acknowledged. Aides and officials understood that they were no longer participating in a struggle for victory, but in the closing administration of a regime. Tasks were carried out with mechanical precision. Orders were typed, files organized, and communications logged, even when there was no expectation that they would influence anything beyond the bunker walls. The routines provided structure, a way to occupy time and delay confrontation with finality. Joseph Goebbels remained closely engaged with Hitler during these days. His role evolved into that of a constant interpreter, reinforcing the idea that endurance itself carried meaning. He framed the collapse as a necessary consequence of historical forces rather than as a failure of leadership or planning. This perspective aligned closely with Hitler's own thinking and provided a form of reassurance, allowing him to see the end not as negation, but as culmination. Martin Bormann continued to manage access and information maintaining tight control over who could speak with Hitler and what reports reached him. This isolation was not solely imposed from outside. Hitler himself preferred it. Conflicting information, questions, or appeals no longer served a purpose. What he sought was consistency, a closed environment where doubt could not intrude. The bunker provided exactly that. The physical environment reinforced this inward turn. Air quality worsened, and the constant presence of machinery noise created a low, unrelenting hum. Sleep was irregular and often interrupted by nearby explosions. Meals were quiet affairs, taken quickly and without conversation. Even familiar faces appeared distant, absorbed in their own thoughts. The sense of collective waiting became more pronounced with each passing hour. Eva Braun remained at Hitler's side, her presence steady and unquestioning. She avoided political discussions and did not involve herself in the increasingly abstract conversations about legacy and history. Instead, she focused on maintaining a sense of personal connection, however fragile. For Hitler, this offered a form of emotional grounding that contrasted with the collapse outside. Her decision to stay was not debated. It was accepted as part of the shared fate now unfolding. Above ground, conditions continued to deteriorate rapidly. Soviet forces captured key positions within the city, tightening control around the government district. German defenders, often isolated and undersupplied, surrendered in growing numbers or were overwhelmed. Civilian suffering intensified as food, water, and medical care became nearly inaccessible. Fires burned unchecked in many areas, and entire neighborhoods ceased to function as organized communities. These developments reached the bunker only in fragments, but their implications were clear. The perimeter was collapsing inward, and the bunker's isolation was becoming physical as well as psychological. The possibility of direct engagement, of the bunker itself becoming a target, was no longer theoretical. Structural integrity, once assumed, became a quiet concern shared by many, but spoken of by few. As night fell and rose again without clear distinction, the sense of finality sharpened. There was no dramatic announcement, no formal acknowledgement that the end was imminent. Instead, it arrived gradually, through Syllul. As April reached its final days, the Führerbunker settled into a state that was neither chaotic nor calm, but restrained by inevitability. Above ground, Berlin was being steadily absorbed into the Soviet advance. The fighting had moved into the government district, and the sounds filtering down into the bunker reflected that closeness. What could be heard was no longer the distant rhythm of a front line, but the irregular noise of a city being dismantled in sections. Inside, however, daily life continued according to familiar routines, shaped less by urgency than by habit. Hitler's conduct during this period showed a noticeable shift. Earlier emotional volatility had given way to a more subdued, controlled demeanor. He still attended briefings, still received reports, but the tone had changed. There was less argument, less insistence on improbable solutions. Instead, his responses were often limited to brief comments or silent acknowledgement. The reports themselves had become repetitive, describing steady Soviet progress and continued German withdrawal or collapse. There was little new information to absorb, and even less that could be acted upon. This change was not acceptance in a practical sense. Hitler did not reconsider his assumptions or acknowledge responsibility for the situation. Rather, he appeared to have reached a point where further engagement with military reality offered no value. The decisions that mattered, in his view, had already been made long before. What remained was not problem-solving, but endurance. Leadership, as he now practiced it, was about maintaining consistency with his beliefs rather than adapting to circumstances. Within the bunker, this shift affected everyone. The chain of command remained formally intact, but its function had narrowed. Orders were still recorded and transmitted where possible, but few expected results. Staff officers continued their duties, preparing documents, organizing communications, and maintaining schedules, even as the relevance of those actions faded. The routine provided structure and distraction, allowing people to function without confronting the full implications of the situation at every moment. Joseph Goebbels remained closely aligned with Hitler's perspective. His conversations emphasized historical framing rather than operational detail. He spoke of how moments of collapse were remembered, of how leaders were judged not only by success, but by how they faced failure. This was not encouragement toward survival or negotiation, but toward coherence. The emphasis was on maintaining an unbroken narrative, one in which retreat or surrender would appear as deviation rather than necessity. Martin Bormann's role continued to be administrative and controlling. Access to Hitler was restricted not because of external threats, but to maintain stability within the bunker. Information was filtered, sometimes delayed, and presented in a way that avoided confrontation. This was not an organized deception so much as a shared understanding that certain discussions no longer served a purpose. The bunker had become a closed environment in which contradiction was quietly excluded. The physical conditions reinforced this inward focus. Ventilation was poor, and the air felt heavy and stale. Sleep patterns were irregular, shaped by fatigue rather than night or day. Nearby explosions occasionally shook the structure, but the bunker itself remained intact. These disturbances were acknowledged without comment, absorbed into the background of daily life. The environment encouraged introspection rather than reaction. Eva Braun remained present throughout these days, though her role was limited to personal rather than political matters. She did not participate in discussions of strategy or legacy. Instead, she maintained familiar routines, focusing on small gestures that suggested continuity. Her presence provided Hitler with a sense of personal loyalty that did not require justification or explanation. It reinforced his belief that remaining in Berlin was a shared decision rather than an imposed one. Outside the bunker, the situation continued to deteriorate in predictable ways. Soviet forces consolidated control over central districts, reducing German resistance to isolated pockets. Supply lines were non-existent, and remaining defenders faced overwhelming force. Civilians endured shortages of food, water, and medical care, often sheltering underground in conditions similar to those inside the bunker, but without protection or authority. These developments were known to those inside, but they no longer provoked discussion. The collapse of Berlin was understood as a process already underway, not as a series of events requiring response. The war, as a system of decisions and consequences, had effectively ended for those underground. What remained was the experience of waiting, shaped by memory, belief, and personal alignment with past choices. As April turned into its final hours, the Führerbunker entered a phase defined by preparation rather than decision. The external situation had stabilized in only one sense: the outcome was fixed. Soviet forces controlled most of central Berlin, and the remaining German resistance was fragmented, isolated, and rapidly disappearing. Inside the bunker, this certainty reshaped behavior. There was no longer an effort to influence events. Instead, attention shifted toward settling affairs, formalizing positions, and bringing long-standing roles to a controlled conclusion. Hitler's focus during this period moved decisively away from military matters. Briefings, when they occurred, were brief acknowledgments rather than discussions. Reports confirmed continued Soviet advances, but they no longer provoked reaction. What occupied Hitler's attention instead were documents. Statements were dictated, records reviewed, and arrangements discussed with a small circle of aides. These activities were deliberate and methodical, reflecting a desire to impose order on the final stage of collapse. This emphasis on documentation was consistent with Hitler's long-standing concern for historical narrative. He viewed the written record as a means of shaping how events would be understood beyond his lifetime. In these final days, that concern intensified. Conversations centered on responsibility, justification, and interpretation. The goal was not reconciliation with reality, but coherence with belief. Defeat was framed not as miscalculation or overreach, but as the inevitable result of forces and failures beyond his control. Those assisting with these tasks understood their significance. Dictation was recorded carefully. Documents were typed, corrected, and retyped. Even as the city above disintegrated, the administrative rituals of the regime were maintained. This was not efficiency in a practical sense, but symbolic continuity. The machinery of authority continued to operate, even when it no longer governed anything beyond the bunker itself. Joseph Goebbels was deeply involved in these efforts. His role during this phase was not operational, but interpretive. He reinforced the idea that the final record mattered more than survival. Discussions between him and Hitler reflected a shared concern with legacy, with how the final days would be remembered rather than how they might be avoided. In this framework, endurance itself was treated as a form of success, independent of outcome. Martin Bormann continued to manage logistics within the bunker, ensuring that documents were secured and that access to Hitler remained controlled. The flow of information was now almost entirely internal. External reports served only to confirm what was already assumed. The bunker had become a closed system, focused inward, concerned with its own final organization, rather than the world outside. The physical environment mirrored this inward concentration. Conditions were increasingly uncomfortable. Air circulation was poor, and the constant use of generators filled the bunker with noise and fumes. Sleep was sporadic, often interrupted by nearby explosions or by the simple difficulty of rest in a confined space. Yet these discomforts were accepted without complaint. They were treated as incidental, no longer worth attention. Eva Braun remained present throughout these preparations, though her role was quiet and personal. She did not participate in political discussions, but she remained close to Hitler, offering a sense of companionship that contrasted with the administrative tone of the bunker. Her presence reinforced the sense that these final actions were not only political, but personal. The decisions being formalized were intertwined with individual identity and loyalty. Outside, the situation continued to deteriorate rapidly. Soviet forces tightened their control over the government district. Fighting moved ever closer to the bunker's entrances. German defenders surrendered in increasing numbers, often after brief and futile resistance. Civilian suffering intensified as basic services collapsed entirely. Fires burned unchecked, and entire sections of the city were reduced to ruins. These developments were known to those inside the bunker, but they no longer shaped behavior. The focus had shifted entirely inward. Time was no longer measured in days or hours, but in tasks completed and documents finalized. Each action felt like a closing gesture, a way of reducing uncertainty by replacing it with formality. The psychological atmosphere during this period was subdued, but tense. There was no outward panic, but there was an acute awareness that the window for action was closing. Conversations were restrained, movements were purposeful. Each person understood, implicitly, that their remaining choices were limited, and that delay no longer offered safety or opportunity. By this stage, the Führerbunker had fully transitioned into its final role. By the final days of April 1945, the Führerbunker no longer functioned as a command center. It had become something else entirely, a closed underground world where reality was slowly replaced by denial. Below ground, however, the situation was discussed as if alternatives still existed. Meetings continued on schedule. Maps were laid out. Arrows were drawn to represent troop movements that no longer had any physical presence. Entire divisions were spoken of as if they were intact, despite having been wiped out weeks earlier. Orders were issued, copied, and distributed, even though there was no realistic way to execute them. The disconnect between the bunker and the battlefield grew wider each day. Hitler's isolation was nearly complete. Information reaching him passed through multiple layers of filtering. Staff officers softened bad news, delayed reports, or altered details to avoid confrontation. Some feared his reactions. Others believed that maintaining morale, even through falsehoods, was preferable to honesty. As a result, decision-making became detached from reality. Armies were ordered to advance that no longer existed. Reinforcements were expected that could never arrive. Counterattacks were planned without fuel, ammunition, or manpower. On paper, the war continued. In reality, it had already ended. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere grew tense and claustrophobic. Air circulation was poor. The constant rumble of explosions above ground reminded everyone that the city was collapsing. Sleep became irregular. Tempers shortened. Conversations grew quieter. Paranoia replaced strategy. Hitler began to question the loyalty of those around him. He suspected betrayal among his generals and doubted reports that contradicted his expectations. Officers avoided eye contact. Honest assessments were avoided entirely. Silence became safer than truth. The bunker's social structure also began to fracture. Some individuals clung to routine as a way to cope. Formal briefings, scheduled meals, and repeated protocols. Others withdrew, mentally preparing for what they knew was inevitable. Communication with the outside world deteriorated rapidly. Telephone lines failed. Radio transmissions became unreliable or went unanswered. Couriers sent above ground often never returned. When messages did arrive, they were fragmented, outdated, or irrelevant by the time they were received. Berlin was no longer connected to the German war effort. It was an isolated pocket surrounded on all sides. Yet inside the bunker, the illusion of control persisted. Hitler continued to issue commands as if authority alone could reverse the situation. The belief that willpower could overcome material reality remained central to his thinking. Admitting defeat was not merely a strategic failure. It was an ideological impossibility. This refusal to acknowledge reality extended to those around him. Some staff members still hoped for a dramatic reversal, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Others recognized the hopelessness of the situation but remained out of duty, fear, or a lack of alternatives. Escape routes were limited. Leaving the bunker meant navigating a city under constant bombardment. Above ground, Soviet forces closed in block by block. German resistance was fragmented and disorganized. Many units consisted of exhausted soldiers, teenagers, or elderly men with minimal training. Supplies were nearly non-existent. The contrast between the devastation outside and the discussions underground could not have been sharper. What remained in the bunker was not leadership in any meaningful sense. It was a performance of authority, briefings without options, decisions without power, commands without consequence. The machinery of the state still existed on paper, but it no longer functioned. The war had already been decided. The outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained was the slow realization that denial could not stop collapse. By the end of April, the bunker was no longer a place of strategy. It was a place of waiting, waiting for silence, waiting for the end, waiting for a reality that could no longer be avoided.